And we're back with our political panel. Rich Lowry is the editor of the National Review. Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent for Slate magazine and a CBS News political analyst. We're also joined by Politico's chief international affairs columnist, Susan Glasser, and the deputy managing editor for Time magazine, Michael Duffy. Michael, I want to start with you. Where are we at the end of this week on this question of Gold Star families and the fight that's grown up around it?
To be continued for sure. There's no question that if the president simply apologized on Monday or after Monday for maligning his predecessor for not calling or writing whatever it is he accused Barack Obama of not doing with respect to this whole thing might have gone away, but instead we got a cascading series of missteps and mistakes that really took 5 days to go through, and I don't think we're quite done. It also not only left the president with another week of sort of 3 steps back, 1 step forward. It ensnared the chief of staff, who took the job to sort of interpose himself between a president who doesn't have all the protocols and pathways of doing this job down, and may never, and potential disaster. And so by stepping into that space and then making some mistakes of his own, Kelly actually added to it, John Kelly. So it was a week that just started bad, got worse, and I think left unanswered a lot of questions about what we're doing in Niger in the first place.
Rich, you wrote that this may be, quote, the stupidest and most unworthy controversy of the year.
Yeah, it's been the most distressing controversy of the year, and that's saying a lot. And this would be a better debate. Maybe it wouldn't even be a debate at all if everyone could concede just a modicum of good intentions and good faith on the other side. It's clear that President Trump's call with the widow of Sergeant Johnson, it landed the wrong way. But it's obvious to me he didn't do that maliciously or callously. In fact, there was a video of a call with another widow of a soldier killed in Afghanistan in April that was posted by the widow because she found it great comfort in this call. And in that call, Trump is sympathetic, he's humane, and he's warm. So I think in this instance, it's incumbent on him, though, to be the bigger figure and to say, look, I did not mean in any way to add to your distress. If I did, I'm sorry, and I'll do anything to make it up to you. But that's obviously not the way he operates.
Right. Jamelle, there does seem to be a lack of restraint here. These things usually end when somebody who has the chance to wallop stops. And on both sides, this is not just, we can figure out who started this, but it's now turned into a regular old political fight.
Right. I mean, I think I agree with Rich that this entire controversy is sort of so small and silly, but I do think it reveals something kind of important about the president, which is that he cannot take responsibility for any mistakes that he's made. From his initial statement maligning his predecessors, that would have ended had he just said, "I'm sorry that I said this. I was wrong." The widow's reaction, Representative Wilson's statement, had he just said, "This was my error," or "I didn't mean it this way," this would have ended. But at every single stage, the president can neither take responsibility or refrain from punching back. And we see this time and time again throughout his presidency. And actually, if we just move away from controversy and scandal and sort of actually being president and doing the job of president, this inability to take responsibility for mistakes or to back down is disastrous. It is a quality that has failed better presidents.
But there are two sides here. She also, in a better world, the Congresswoman, would have gone to John Kelly privately and said, you know what, they were very upset by that call. Is there anything you can do to make it right? Instead, she blows it up, and she's enjoying her 15 minutes of fame over this family's distress, which is disgusting in its own right.
Susan, let me ask you about the larger point Kelly made this week, but that also John McCain made, George W. Bush made, President Obama made, which was that this dropping of standards. Chief of Staff Kelly said, whether it's religion or the treatment of women or now this fight intruding on this sacred space. There was just this cry this week from a variety of quarters that standards have dropped totally.
And that's almost indisputable. But I think, look, Jamelle is absolutely right. We're not surprised that Donald Trump behave this way, because it's very consistent with what we've seen from President Trump throughout not only his presidency but his campaign. He's not going to back away from a fight if one is offered. In fact, he tends to encourage them. I think it's more surprising what we saw in a way from General Kelly. We learned more. One of the things that's been apparent over the last couple months, but this underscored, is that it remains Donald Trump's White House and not John Kelly's White House, even if he has imposed more discipline and more of a process. Number one. Number two, perhaps we saw that General Kelly this week shares more of Donald Trump's agenda than we realized. And you talked about the standards dropping. I found General Kelly's comment to be surprising and even puzzling, that he would have brought up in the same commentary about this incident with the Gold Star families, this notion that in the good old days women were sacred, and isn't it so terrible that we can get there? A lot of people have talked about the irony of working for a president who's been accused of this kind of behavior. But to me, there's that issue, working for Donald Trump, but there's also the question of, what's the good old days exactly? Is that what this America Firstism is about? Is about looking backwards to some halcyon and almost mythic past that somehow was better?
Well, he could have been groping for a kind of understanding of what's a common idea.
No pun intended. John, jeez.
Sorry. Get your minds out of the gutter, guys. But he's fumbling to try and touch on something that you had many other people talking about this week. And Michael, the Chief of Staff was there to try to explain how signals were missed.
It was a classic damage control operation by a White House Chief of Staff. And even though he seemed politically naive with that comment, I agreed with you. He's fundamentally a political person. More than the speeches this week by McCain and Bush about the dropping of standards or the loss of something else, it's an amazing week in this respect, which is that the Republican Party has never been more dominant in American politics in 100 years, and it's never been more split wide open, cracking apart in front of our eyes. You had two of the most esteemed figures of the Republican establishment, John McCain and George W. Bush, of all people, who has been reluctant to say anything since he left the Oval Office about anyone, come out this week and actually in encoded terms, not very coded, criticize the Trump White House and Donald Trump for his handling not only of his rhetoric, but of his foreign policy and a lot of other things. This was on top of McCain's rather remarkable, what did he call it? Half-baked, half-baked neo-nationalism. That party split that's war this week. That's not words of war. That's war, and that's happening at the same time that they're seemingly in control of everything.
And yet, Rich, on the Monday, the president was with Mitch McConnell at the White House, showing a picture of unity.
Yeah, the least convincing bromance of all time is Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. There is a civil war in the Republican Party, and the irony is this civil war really began before the election. It was papered over during the election, and they won everything at the national level. And Trump is still sort of trying to be the pivotal figure who can work with both sides. He likes Steve Bannon. He understands why Steve Bannon is upset. Yet Mitch McConnell is his best friend, and he's going to try to work with him on the Hill. So Trump, in a lot of ways, this leads to an incoherence in his own governance. He doesn't know whether he wants Lamar Alexander, the senator from Alexander, to cut a bipartisan deal, or he wants to be with the House Freedom Caucus and conservative purists who oppose that kind of approach.
I think it may speak to sort of a broader exhaustion of the traditional, or at least since Reagan, traditional framework for Republican politics, right? That you have a Republican Party whose base is increasingly people who actually look to government for some sort of assistance. Trump's message spoke to them. He promised to defend Medicaid. He promised to defend Medicare. He promised to defend Social Security. But this is joined to sort of a more traditional Republican activist class, Republican affluent voters who want tax cuts, who want things like Obamacare repeal. And winning hasn't really done anything to sort of reconcile those differences whatsoever.
Final 30 seconds, Susan.
Well, I have to say, I do agree with you, but I'm struck by the fact that for Senator McCain, for George W. Bush, their speeches fundamentally are about America's role in the world.
Right.
And, this is the major foreign policy rift. It's why that part of the Republican Party was so active against Donald Trump during the campaign. They believe that regardless of your views on domestic policy or health care, that Trump is pulling the United States away from the international order in a way that actually threatens to undermine all those institutions, which, by the way, we built and rigged in our favor. And so that's what's interesting to me, is you have the foreign policy part of the Republican Party standing up and saying no.
All right, we're going to have to stand up and say no. I'm afraid we're out of time. So thanks to all of you, and we'll be right back.